Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we're here to discuss the electricity market design proposal of the European Commission, much heralded, and proposed by the Commission following the recent energy price crisis, of course. But of course, the electricity market design proposal is intended to cover a lot more things than trying to follow up the electricity price crisis and the issues that have been raised: consumer rights, how to integrate increasing amount of renewables into the electricity mix, the evolution of markets, REMIT. And the Commission has tabled this fairly recently. The co-legislators are now moving ahead at record speed. So we have today really the A-team to discuss this. Leonardo, the director of the Florence School of Regulation, has recently tabled a paper on this, which I commend to you to read, that asks the question, not just what is in the proposal and what should be in the proposal, but also what isn't. And that's really worthwhile looking at. Then we have Katarina. Thank you for joining us today, Katarina, the director in charge of this proposal and the brain behind it. So we look forward to see what Katarina has to say following Leonardo's comments. And then we're very fortunate enough to have Nicolas Gonzalez Caceres, the Member of Parliament and the rapporteur from ITRA for the report. And finally, Pierre Tardieu, the Chief Policy Officer of Wind Europe. So I'm going to start with Leonardo and invite you to present your thoughts and your paper on this, and then I'll invite Katarina to take the floor. Leonardo.
Thank you, Christopher. And you are organizing this indeed in a perfect moment. Okay, here's the slide. So as Christopher said, we just published this policy brief. I wrote it in my own name, but many colleagues have been very kind in giving feedback, which has allowed us, I think, to make some comments. It has also been a file that we have been following since the beginning, so it has been really a pleasure. And it has also been very interesting to see under how difficult conditions this reform had to be made, and in which record time Katarina and her team had to come up with this reform. And I think it's also important to take that context into account when we are discussing this proposal. So first of all, I thought to mention to you that we think there was around autumn, September, October, lots of proposals that have been made where we felt, and we already wrote a policy brief in December, that many of these proposals that were basically targeting at changing the electricity short-term market pricing signal were probably well-intended, but to our feeling, not really the issue to address. While we did see during this crisis that some issues emerged, maybe they were not new, but you could say that the crisis magnified some of these issues and maybe increased the urgency to act on some of these issues. And you see them listed there, and I will have one slide on each of them, always saying a bit more about the issue. Then, as Christopher said, I will comment on what's in the proposal, but also what's not in there and what was part of the discussion, and then also discuss, what some things are maybe that could still be changed to the proposal, or some things we would prefer not to see being added to this proposal. So first on what we think was not really an issue to address, which is this electricity short-term pricing signal. It's as if we went through an identity crisis. So I've been following electricity markets since 2002. And since 2002, I've always been critical. No, I've always been saying we need to improve this market. But I never thought we would actually question, to drop everything we have co-created the last 20 years. And it seems as if in this crisis, we all of a sudden were even questioning, right, the fundamental things of what we achieved the last 20 years, which made me very, very worried and made me almost pause my normal work on helping to improve this market and to just go around and say, please don't throw away everything we did here, because it's actually quite useful. It's not only quite useful, in the past, also in the going forward, I think we will really need these short-term markets even more than before. It's the best mechanism we have to make sure electricity flows to where it's most needed. And also, you know, until the quarter level, so in very granular level, you know, it doesn't only organize the big flows, but also at the smallest level. So many proposals were made to change that mechanism. And in that brief from December, we already argued why, you know, maybe they sound appealing, these ideas, but they would be rather counterproductive. That's why when the proposal came out in March, I think the first thing we did is to really applaud that the Commission resisted the pressure and that has not picked up some of these proposals, right? And to stick by what we had created the last 20 years. So that, you know, maybe is unusual to do, to applaud the Commission for what is not in the proposal, but I think here it was really appropriate to do that. And I think we've not been the only ones doing that. Then on what is in the proposal and what are some of the issues that really needed to be addressed, right? I think we've had unprecedented prices, and not only for a certain number of hours, but really for months, no? That average prices were really higher than we were used to. So that as an electricity market expert, you also had to show some humility because we were not used to discuss market design, taking into account the impact on the wider economy, right? We were not used to electricity markets causing inflation. So I think we also had to consider that as part of our discussion when we look at markets. So I think initially what happened is that many countries took all kind of national emergency measures. Acer developed a dashboard. There are really many of them. And they went from handing out vouchers to capping or regulating retail prices. Many countries did a combination of all of these. And of course, it was natural. We did not yet have a European organized way of responding. So I think it was normal to allow countries to do what they felt appropriate. The think tank Bruegel has also been good in mapping all of this and showing that this has led to something like 600, 700 billion being handed out. So that's really massive. So that's why maybe it's good that the current proposal not only defines a crisis, so in case it happens again, that we already know when we will respond, but also how we will respond. And the proposal harmonizes the response in, I think, a good way, because to my feeling, we should not be capping or regulating retail bills entirely. We should still keep some incentive to save energy. And the way to do that in the proposal is to say you can intervene at national level during a crisis, but only support 70% of historical consumption for SMEs and 80% for households. That means that they're still exposed to real market prices for at least 30 and 20%. And this is sometimes referred to as block tariffs. And I think it's a very good compromise between, still keeping an incentive to save energy to everyone, but also controlling inflation during a crisis. Because if we would just hand out vouchers, for instance, we would not be intervening in retail bills and we would not be helping inflation. So that's something I think we've learned. Countries that already did that during the crisis include Austria and Germany. And I think that's now the response that most people agree is the best way to deal with the crisis. Then, of course, there can still be some discussion on how to exactly define a price crisis. The proposal already provides a definition that has 3 components. One is that the wholesale price should be 2.5 times higher than normal. Normal is then looking back, right? And then it should also be higher over a certain period. So expected to be significantly higher, 2.5 times for something like 6 months. The same also at retail level. At retail level, prices need to be 70% higher than normal, again, for these 6 months. And there should also be an element that we are worried that this increase in prices has an impact on the wider economy, right? Which is what happened during the last crisis. Okay, so that's how we think to deal with energy poverty. And now Another aspect that we discovered, another issue that emerged, is that we realized that maybe consumers and retailers are not sufficiently hedged, and that we should be doing something about that. Again, this is something we already knew before the crisis, but we've never experienced the consequences so strongly as during this crisis. So some retailers went bankrupt. We also realized that maybe not all consumers should be exposed to the same level of dynamic prices, right? Because if you are somewhat vulnerable, maybe it's better to not risk, to be exposed to this type of prices. We also noticed that it's possible that fixed price contracts are offered in a way that is not 100% transparent, that some retailers try to get out of these contracts or change the prices and not always communicated so clearly about that. There is a really nice book report with case studies on what happened. And also forward markets. It has always been known, Acer and CER annually in their market monitoring report have always been saying we don't yet have sufficiently developed forward markets, but it's only now that we're like, okay, we really have to do something about this. So that's why I think it's good that the proposal has all these elements. Consumers will be entitled to choose between having more dynamic or more fixed price, or even a combination of that. And we will have more clear information about what that all means. Then I think also very nice is this concept of supplier of last resort, which was already in legislation as something member states could do, but didn't have to do. Now they are expected to do that in each country. And also there will be some supervision on making sure that retailers, when they offer fixed price contracts, that they actually have appropriate hedging strategies so that they don't go bankrupt during a crisis when consumers actually want to count on these contracts the most. And of course, in harmonizing and integrating forward markets, it was also good to take an additional step. And there you have this concept of these long-term transmission rights, which can help. And also this idea that they can be combined with virtual hubs that still need to be created. Then I think a lot of discussion has already happened around how will that really be implemented, right? These appropriate hedging strategies, I think it's well intended. We do need some additional oversight in retail markets, but of course we also want to avoid that this creates unnecessary entry barriers for smaller players, for instance. And of course, also that this is not implemented in a way that actually is counterproductive, right? Because some big companies might already do appropriate hedging strategies. But if we define exactly certain quotas on how to do that, maybe that's not the way to go. And here, I think the proposal still leaves some room to member states. So I guess a job of regulators could also be to come together and to provide some guidance maybe to all regulatory authorities that do not yet know exactly how to do this, but I understood that there are already a few regulators that started doing this, so there are a few practices that could inspire the others. On virtual hubs, a lot of discussion also took place. Some people are worried that it would maybe destroy the liquidity in markets that are already working well. Some others don't know exactly how it will work. Well, I think it definitely has potential. And there will, in any case, be a whole process to implement this, right? This could be implemented, for instance, through network codes and guidelines, and that would allow everyone to make sure that it's implemented in a good way, right? Because it does make sense to consider this option at least. If we then go to the next big issue, as I highlighted here, it's also this issue that we saw that in some countries, renewables had received a lot of subsidies, and all of a sudden they were making a lot of money because prices were really high, right? And that led to some intervention. And then the question is, how can we organize this maybe differently so that this type of intervention is not needed anymore, but consumers feel that they have access to these renewables that are becoming cheaper and cheaper. So I guess part of the issue is that some consumers actually woke up. Maybe in the past, you would not necessarily bother putting a PV panel on your roof because you were not yet fully convinced of the economics, and you would rather do it because you wanted to be sustainable and green. Now I think the skeptics woke up and realized maybe we should all put a PV panel on our roof if we have the money to do so. And I have had many private conversations of people that probably wished they would have done it earlier, and they are finally doing it. The same applies to some businesses. Maybe the rate of return was not as good as they thought, and now they know that we should actually be doing all of this. And this was already foreseen in the clean energy package. So a lot of possible innovations foreseen in the clean energy package, I think, will now pick up much more rapidly because there is a lot of room for individual as well as collective action. Also, PPAs are nothing new. They already exist. But again, it's more likely that more industries will be looking at this opportunity. And then I think it's good also that the proposal makes sure that more people have the opportunity to enter into this type of contracts. And as I said, when starting, I guess the main problem was that we had, in many cases, designed renewable support schemes that were one-sided, probably because we never thought they would actually earn so much money during a crisis like that. So what is really good about the proposal, I think, is that it strengthens these concepts of the clean energy package, like energy sharing. It also improves the availability of power purchase agreements. The idea is that member states would, for instance, provide some state-backed guarantees so that if a company has not a high enough credit rating, they would still be able to conclude a PPA. Also, developers would be encouraged to contract with consumers, maybe also not only with industrial consumers, and that could be a criteria that is taken into account if a developer asks for support, so that they could ask part of the project to be supported, part of the project is already under a long-term contract. And I guess everybody agrees that we have learned that support scheme should be two-sided. So that's why I think we have that harmonization of support schemes for renewables and nuclear into two-way CFDs. CFDs in this case is defined as a support scheme. So a kind of a contract between the developer and a government entity. Now, is that is that everything? And what is next? Well, what is next is we are not sure to what extent certain countries will actually promote PPA, so promote this more market-based approach, or rely more on this government-backed CFD. And then to the extent that a lot of countries would really go all out in covering new assets by CFDs, I think then we really also have to talk about the details of how those contracts will be designed. And if there are a lot of revenues collected through these contracts, how they will be allocated, because the proposal already says that we should avoid, that there are distortions, but the more money is being allocated and the more freedom is given to member states to allocate that money, the more there is a risk for distortions. Also, I think these contracts can be designed in a way that the developer still has the incentive of short-term market prices, which is very important, so that they still feel that they need to be available when the system really needs them to be available, and that they maybe spontaneously also don't run when prices are zero or negative and we don't want them to run. And maybe on that, we had the idea that the proposal could foresee that these kind of more detailed guidelines could be worked out in the next stage, just to avoid, that there would be implementations that are distorting. And I think also some member states already have experience, and they already went through one implementation, then improved the implementation. So I think the others that are still starting could actually learn also from that, right? So these guidelines could also be simply some minimum level of harmonization that we know already works. Then, and now I'm coming towards the end, and that's also, I think, the topic where we are maybe more worried about for the future, right? Investment uncertainty, because maybe we had to intervene to a certain extent in the market, but you can also not deny that is somewhat worrying for the future, right? So how can we now just give confidence to people to invest, because we need them to invest even at a much higher pace than they did in the past, right? If we want to be compliant with Fit for 55, but also want to make sure that our dependence on Russian gas is reduced. So what was the issue? Well, we've always said we won't intervene in wholesale markets, right? There has always been a debate, will energy-only markets provide enough incentives for investments or not? And I think in Europe, at least, we've been good in not intervening. In other places in the world, there has been more interventions. That's why in other places in the world, they had already a bigger role for what is called these capacity mechanisms. In Europe, so far, we took the stance that they can be implemented at national level, but we don't really encourage countries to have these kind of mechanisms. I also understand why the current proposal does not necessarily reopen the discussion on capacity mechanisms, because that would potentially lead us in all kind of directions. So we might need to take a bit more time to have that conversation with a more detailed impact assessment, which was not possible in this very short time frame. But still, if it's not done now, I guess that could be the conversation we need to have on what the next Commission will do. And I would argue that Europeanization and a modernization of these mechanisms to guide investments is definitely something to look at. And something I hope we will be able to avoid is that some countries might want to continue with some of these clawback mechanisms, because it seems that some countries believe that we should continue to do that. I'm very happy that it was not part of the proposal. A full impact assessment is not yet available. Acer announced to come out with a more detailed impact assessment of these clawback mechanisms by July this summer. But from what you hear is that it's very hard to have a clawback mechanism that doesn't create distortions. For instance, how you treat long-term contracts or forward contracts in these mechanisms is really tricky. If you discard them entirely, basically you are just assuming that the generator profits are whatever revenues would result from selling in the short-term markets. And if that's the way you tax them, well, then they don't have an incentive anymore to hedge, right? And that's bad. But then if you say, we will look at these contracts when we determine the amount of revenue we claw back, then you give generators the opportunity to sign a favorable contract with the retail business, and then they're just moving the profits from the generation business to the retail business, and you're creating distortions in the retail market. So to my feeling, the experience is that these mechanisms were well intended. I fully understand why they were introduced during this crisis, but the experience has not been very positive. So I would be really concerned if we would already decide to keep them in place. And that's it from me, Christopher.
Leo, before I pass over to Katarina, I think it would be really helpful to everybody. Could you explain to us what virtual hubs are and how they work and why they might be useful?
Yes. So the more, so today you could say there is two ways to hedge, right? So you could say, I'm hedging against the price of Germany or against the price in another country. But the more we would go to smaller zones, the more you want to hedge from point to point, the more contracts you need, right? Because there are many combinations between all the points, you could say. And then it might be difficult to create liquidity between each combination of locations. So then what you can do is to say, okay, like, I don't know, the Nordics, there is a virtual point in the Nordics, and everybody tries to hedge from their own location to that virtual point. And okay, then the hedge is not perfect, but at least the liquidity would be higher. So then the question is, you have an imperfect hedge with a good liquidity, or do you keep a more perfect hedge with a low liquidity, right? That's a bit the way I would explain it.
Great, many thanks, Leo. Now, Katarina, in preparing his paper, Leonardo gathered together the various professors of the Florence School of Regulation, and everybody knows trying to get an opinion from a bunch of professors is like herding cats. And the second thing everybody knows is the first question academics ask themselves when they see a commission proposal is what's wrong with it. They don't ask what's right with it. And as Leo said, remarkably in this proposal, we couldn't really find much to criticize about this. And considering that this was done without an impact assessment, that is quite an accolade. But that being said, Katerina, it'd be really great to hear your take on what are the most important parts of this proposals and where you see the priorities.
Many thanks, Chris, and many thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry. First, I would want to congratulate Leo for herding the cats, herding the professors to a consensual report, which obviously I don't need to say it. We like a lot because it is very positive on the Commission proposal. So maybe just a couple of points on the elements that that Leonardo went through. So I think indeed, we were working against the situation when there was perhaps the biggest supply disruption Europe has ever witnessed. So Russian gas was cut off to a large number of member states, and Russia also cut electricity supply to some member states that used to import from there. So that is unprecedented. And on top of that, we also had scarcity in the electricity sector. So drought in the Iberian Peninsula and in the Nordics. I don't need to mention the French nuclear power plants. So we also had scarcity situation in the electricity sector proper. So these two, you may call it like a perfect storm, something we were obviously not prepared for in our policies. But I think here our conclusion is that actually, thanks to the well-functioning market and the relatively well interconnected market, we coped with this shock. We had no blackouts. Prices obviously were high, but the prices directed electricity from where it was produced to where it was needed. So just one example here, France, having been an exporting country for a very long time, turned overnight into an importing country. So, and that's where the prices helped this happen. So what we could say is that the short-term market did work, but at the same time, we were lacking the signals, long-term price signals. And that we could see. I mean, households who had to face the very high prices suffered a lot. We could not anymore speak about vulnerable households because many middle-class households became vulnerable with those prices. Our companies lost competitiveness vis-a-vis, for instance, American companies because of the high prices. So there were many real economic, social impacts from the situation. And here, as you mentioned, member states did take measures. Commission proposed many measures, crisis measures and others, to support consumers over the crisis. One measure maybe that was not used extensively was taxation, because we indeed proposed to use the clawback measure for extraordinary profits. An alternative that was used for the fossil industry could have also been to use taxation measure where member states are obviously competent. So there were many ways member states supported their consumers, households and companies that were very different from one country to the other. And I think that is something, a lesson learned as well. Europe is very diverse. The electricity mixes are very different from one country to the other, and therefore also the solutions that worked best in different member states were different. So we are going to report on the implementation of this crisis measure early June. So you will then be able to read more about our assessment on how it worked and what were the lessons learned from that. I think there, having mentioned the consumers, and you also, Leonardo, underlined it, that many consumers were not protecting themselves. They were on spot prices, and perhaps nobody had told them that the low spot prices that we saw before the crisis in any event may not remain low for the future to come. So consumers were not prepared, were not hedged, suppliers were not hedged, many left the market and left then the consumers in the cold. And that's why I think on the one hand, information, better information to consumers, which is in our proposal, is crucial. Every consumer needs to understand what are the risks of different types of contracts so that they can best protect themselves. So that is something where a prudential market player would address these elements already, but what we learned from the crisis that not many are prudential without some nudging, without some regulation to ensure that this happens. Then on the cheap renewables, access to cheaper renewables. I think that is something which is obvious, which is important, and the more we have renewables, the less we rely also on imports of fossils, and in particular from Russian sources. But we also need to keep in mind that the renewables are capex intensive, so very low opex, but high capex, and this capex needs to be paid for, and that is where the market price has played its role. And any risk or any measure that makes it difficult for the investors to assess their future revenues can slow down investments. But what we have then foreseen in the proposal is that we know that with more renewables, with more solar and with more wind, there will be also more variability in the future electricity system. And that's why we wanted to make sure that member states look at what are the needs in terms of flexibility, mostly demand side responsibility and storage, that would match the variability of the increasing amount of renewables. And this measure, this flexibility measure that later on could also feed into hydrogen production, is something that we believe is an essential counterpart to go together with renewables to ensure that the low operating cost of renewables can benefit consumers in lower prices. So we need to ensure that the investments take place. There is investment certainty, which is to ensure, and that's where all the measures that we have in the proposal come into play. So making sure that the short-term markets work more efficiently, making sure that there's a possibility to hedge up to 3 years, making sure that there is also a possibility to hedge even longer through PPAs, and then where government support is needed through contract for difference. So all these measures together would also then give the certainty for investors that they can recuperate their investment costs in a fair manner, not with too many profits, but not under too little profits either. So therefore, here I think it's the main point where I have a little bit of a different assessment than Leo in your report. I think that with the measures that we have put together, there is no acute need to review the capacity mechanisms. They remain there. They are implemented. Many member states do have capacity mechanisms, and that's why where one can ensure that there is adequacy in place always. So as soon as we have the European Resource Adequacy Assessment approved, unfortunately has not been approved by ACER yet, but we believe that it will be approved this year, and that will give member states also then the framework, the reference against which to assess their adequacy, which obviously they can then complement with further assessments. So that's why we believe that with the current instruments in place under the Clean Energy Package, the adequacy, secure supply can be ensured as with the measures we have. I think I leave it here, and I look very much forward to the co-panelists and also to the Q&A. Thank you.
Katarina, just a couple of questions, if I may, before we move on. I've never seen so many questions in the chat box in one of our seminars, so there's an enormous amount of interest. I'll try and summarize a few of the questions. A lot of the questions are on the links between CFDs and PPAs. Is it not true that by promoting CFDs, you're going to cannibalize the PPA market, so that producers will always prefer to have a guaranteed CFD available rather than go to the PPA market? So isn't this killing the CFD market? Secondly, as a number of member states have said they would like to keep flexibility regarding their support schemes and not simply have CFDs and only CFDs for renewable support. Does that make sense? I'm going to do 4 questions just to get the maximum value for money out of you. The third one, we have a question of for hyper electro-intensive industries, so the electro-intensives that consume huge amounts of electricity. They are going to find it really difficult to sign renewable PPAs because of the potential risk involved in shaping renewable electricity, because they of course need electricity on a flat basis. Are there any thoughts about how to help them? And then the last question, which we're all actually really wanting to ask you, which is, this proposal has been made without an impact assessment. And so, you know, you haven't really completely revised capacity mechanisms, or you haven't really revised the pricing mechanism of the market. You haven't done the fundamental stuff. Are you working on a more in-depth proposal that we're going to get in the new commission?
Many thanks for the questions. So first on the PPAs and CFDs, I mean, first we need to keep in mind that the contract for difference are for those renewables that require public support. So we do believe that, first of all, and what we see on the market is that there will be a lot of investments taking place in renewables on purely market-based basis, so purely on the energy-only market as they happen today. Then, in addition, somebody who wants to have more certainty can sign a PPA, and there are many member states who already have a relatively well-developed PPA market. So therefore, and also which is based on private supply and demand for such contracts. So I would not expect contract for difference to cannibalize the market. We need private investments, because we need to keep in mind that with contract for difference, today prices are high and governments would be collecting money most likely through them. But we are, I'm sure, coming back to a situation where prices may not be high, and you certainly remember that some years ago we were speaking about the missing money problem, whereby there was not enough money to invest in the capital intensive renewables. So I think, and I would assume governments to be quite wary about this situation, that signing too many contract for difference may create liabilities for the future. So I think that would, for me, be a clear sign that one weighs very carefully how much public support will be needed, and where it is not needed, let the private sector flourish. Then on some member states wanting to have the possibility to use different support schemes. I mean, again, what we have seen today in the crisis a situation where member states had premia on top of market prices. And in the high price situation, that was probably one of the worst kind of support schemes one could think of. So what we wanted to do with the two-way contract core difference is to make sure that then if we face in the future situations where prices again are very volatile, very high, that this volatility, these high prices is clawed back and will not then create a similar unfortunate situation where our consumers were this time. So I think there, if we think about what is the aim of our proposal, to give more stability, if you wish, in prices for consumers, I think using other types of support schemes when direct price support is the tool would be unfortunate. And then electricity intensive industries, I mean, they can sign PPAs with renewables, but indeed, as you said, if they need certainty of 24/7, there are many ways of having long-term contracts with suppliers. These don't need to be only renewable PPAs. So, and just to give you an anecdotal example is that in my home country, Finland, the electricity intensive industries did build some of the nuclear power plants to be sure that they have electricity whenever they need it, and massive amounts of it. So I'm sure the electricity intensive industries can find ways of ensuring electricity 24/7 at the best prices they can find on the market. And we actually, in our proposal, we were more concerned about the smaller companies who don't have the creditworthiness to go for a PPA, and that's why we proposed measures to help them. And then the last one on the lack of impact assessment, I would still want to invite everybody to read the staff working document that accompanied the proposal, which is, I think, providing you with the elements on why we made the proposal as it is and what are the expected benefits. I personally even feel that it is an easier read than the traditional impact assessments, but that's my personal view. I mean, your question on the next commission, I think you should put to the next commission. I mean, I'm a civil servant and we will do what the commission asks us to do. And for the time being, we're waiting to see what happens in the future. Many thanks.
Thanks, Katarina. I knew you were going to say that, but I had to ask it, didn't I? I would like to thank in advance Mr. Nicolas Gonzalez Casares. Nicolas, thank you so much for joining us today. You must be the busiest man in the Parliament at the moment. If I understand correctly, you've tabled your draft report. The deadline for proposed amendments from your fellow MEPs was yesterday or the day before. And I assume you have one or two suggested amendments, probably no more than that. Then there was the discussion in ITRA yesterday, I understand. And so now it will be a question of putting forward the next iteration of your draft report. We are really, really interested to hear what you think are your key concerns and what you believe the Parliament's key concerns. Or will you be like the Florence School of Regulation, which say we actually think this is pretty good?
Thank you. First, I am very busy these days also because we are in elections in Spain. So I have local and regional elections and I'm campaigning here in Spain nowadays. So traveling to Brussels, to my hometown. So to express my gratitude to Commissioner Andries and the Florence School of Regulation for inviting me. And I also want to thank all the participants for their interest. I would like to also express my gratitude to Leonardo for the policy briefs. If I recall correctly, the brief was published on the same day as the deadline for submitting my draft report. So luckily, I tried to incorporate some of your ideas. The energy systems are undergoing a significant change, not just to address climate change, but also for clear economic reasons. But first, before going into the details of my proposal and to comment some things on my proposal, I would like to know if we have wondered, it is clear first which are the reasons of this proposal. We have lived a crisis, a very huge crisis of prices of electricity and also energy. And I would like to know if we have wondered what would happen if we had simply left the market during this crisis. Would have happened without interventions? What would inflation will be in Portugal or Spain without the Iberian section? As a defender of the European project, I am concerned that we are not able to see that our enemies have a weapon currently in the market design, and we must protect ourselves. What will happen to the anti-European populists if we have not alleviated this crisis? Can a reform of the electricity market be separated from the reality of the citizens? So I think that we need tools to address the problems we have faced previously. And I also want to say that tools for all the Europeans, not only for a small portion of Europeans. I can see some proposal right nowadays to give 5 billion to some consumers in some countries, but I not see this capacity in other countries to do that. So we need tools to protect all the Europeans, not only a few. So this is for me like a first point that I want to mention, because yes, the electricity market design has very technical issues, but also very political ones. I think that is important to mention. And I think that we need the electrification to succeed. Electricity must be competitive, affordable, not cheap, affordable. And unfortunately, the wholesale market prices that we observe for electrification in your party. I think that the future highly electrified system must incorporate elements of reliability to avoid social crises, such as the one we have experienced. Transporting, heating, cooling. I think that they cannot rely on electrification without structural measures that can cope with new shocks in future. I think that the record prices have affected the support of electrification. I concur with the policy brief's evaluation, the Commission's proposal. Preserving short-term market electricities is important, as well as implementing additional measures to address concerns during times of crisis. And in the Leonardo's paper, I noticed that you discussed the risk involved in the trilogue negotiations. I understand your concerns regarding the revenue clawback mechanisms, for example. It is important to note that without European ex-ante tools, any future crisis will have to be dealt with through improvised and potentially unsafe emergency regulations. This lack of predictability can be bad, detrimental to both investors and consumers as well. So this price crisis has shown that in the face of serious disturbance, the current market designs, protection and stabilization measures are insufficient. Proof of adopted very fast to try to stop the bleeding that the current design of the electricity market was causing. not only for electricity consumers, also at the economic level. In my opinion, it's important to implement European rules that limit the excessive profits of power generators during time of price crisis. Only during time of price crisis and temporary measures. This way, some of those rules can be used to mitigate future price shocks. Measures like I propose provides predictability to consumers and investors by knowing the rules in advance, and also avoids fragmentation of the internal market through the introduction of common rules, because the fragmentation of the internal market is also in risk when some countries can give a lot of subsidies and others cannot. So this is, I think, one of the risks we are facing. Regarding the different tools in the medium and long-term market, I want to mention that I agree with most of the things that the Commission has proposed. My purpose is to win in accuracy, to support, and also trying to improve these tools. Regarding CFD, I support the idea of including more detailed criteria for the implementation of the two-way CFDs, including being exposed to the incentives of the short-term wholesale prices. Another tricky topic highlighted by this paper is the allocation of the revenues from CFD. I have proposed to prioritize to those consumers who need it most, not to all the consumers. I think that it should be targeted consumers. Moreover, it should be oriented towards energy efficiency measures contributing to energy savings. Also, these revenues should, in my opinion, be allocated to compensate the CFD's costs. Regarding PPAs, I think that is another way to private financing renewable generation, new capacity, while providing long-term stability to the consumer. I think PPAs are right for that. But on the other hand, however, I think that this market is limited right now to large vertically integrated energy companies. I propose more transparency through a European database and standardization of PPAs for voluntary use. In addition, the creation of a platform for PPA trading. The idea behind this proposal is to facilitate the entry of small players. Regarding capacity and flexibility and capacity mechanisms, Leonardo gave a workshop in the Parliament before the release of the proposal. There he explained that considering the crisis, the experts were questioning the energy-only markets and looking at the necessity of modernizing the capacity mechanisms. I think that to protect ourselves from the price volatility of fossil fuels and to carry out an efficient integration of renewables into the electricity system, we should have measures that provide flexibility to the grid through active demand-side management and storage. While respecting strict environmental criteria, I also think that capacity mechanisms should also be considered as a structural part, considering existing flexibility, especially in cases where there is a high penetration of variable sources and, of course, low interconnection of overpayments. Also, I like the idea of modernizing and to make more European capacity mechanisms. I have included an amendment to assess it. And finally, one of the things for me more important is the social aspects of the electricity. Is the objective of this reform. I think that we should also reinforce the rights and guarantees of consumers, especially again the most vulnerable ones and those in the situation of energy poverty. Among other measures, I propose to introduce the obligation for member states to prohibit the disconnection of vulnerable consumers, including those affected by the energy poverty, and to guarantee the right of citizens to receive electricity supply to cover their basic needs. Finally, to conclude, we must work for a future-proof market design to solve the situation raised by this energy crisis, accelerate renewable energy deployment, and improve our competitiveness and security, energy security by default. Now we have the opportunity. But if we don't have clear rules to avoid another shocks, the electrification of the economy cannot happen. For me, this is also an opportunity to carry out a social reform of the electricity market in balance with the need to ensure the necessary investments in renewable technologies. I think that the energy transition should be with everyone on board. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. That was terrific, and at least I personally really loved the sort of citizen-centric approach that just flows through everything that you've said. I know you've got to leave in 3 minutes, but perhaps I can just pose one or two questions that have come through the chat. One of the things that you really highlighted really well, if I may say, is how do you get the balance right in terms of protecting against future price shocks? And that's really a difficult one, because as we all know, on the one hand, we need to have protection against future price shocks, and the Commission's proposed something. On the other hand, we know that, and we know from what happened in 2013, when member states changed support schemes and renewable investment just crashed for years, that investment certainty is also really important as well. So how do you get how do you think you need to get the balance right between having future proofing for future price shocks, whilst making sure that new renewables investors know where their money, know the conditions of where they are going to be investing, particularly if a mechanism would allow member states to diverge very considerably on how they would deal with future price shocks. And the third is, how would that deal with splitting up the internal market? So I think that would be the first question of how you get that absolutely right. I'll stop with that one, give you that one, and then perhaps just come back with one more question, if I may.
Thank you for the question. It's right that this balance is sometimes very difficult to achieve, but my proposal, I'm saying that we will set a revenue cap when the prices are over the medium average of the last 5 years, with a multiplier of 2 and at least for 3 months. So it's not very easy to have this possibility of the revenue cap. And this revenue cap is only is going to happen when the prices are very high. And the cap is high enough to give revenues to renewables. And it's going to happen probably, I'm not saying never, but probably few times, and should be limited in time. There are some amendments now, because it was my proposal, but we have some amendments now from other groups calling also and sharing this revenue cap possibility. They have other proposals, but of course we are feeling that we have a common ground. For example, we can say that this revenue cap should be installed if we have exogenous influences, for example. But in any case, we need to protect ourselves, because it is clear that we need also the people to be confident in this energy transition, to get them on board. And we need a massive deployment of renewables. It's already happening in some countries and in some regions, people against renewables. So if they don't feel that renewables protect them, not only for climate, but also for the pockets, and the generator companies don't have incredible revenues like the ones that we have seen during this crisis, we are also giving a message that investing in renewables is good for the planet, for the people, and also for the pockets and for the European industry. So this is the right balance. But saying to be like a nihilism that no, this is never going to happen. We don't need rules. We don't need rules for emergency for future. Is saying that is not a good idea, and also we are not giving enough predictability. And let me be clear, the market can be broken for some mechanisms. This is only an emergency mechanism that you can set, the Commission can set under certain very clear rules. But meantime, other member states are breaking the market with enormous subsidies, and nobody are saying anything on that. But we are seeing this possibility. So there are some countries that are saying, okay, but this is crazy. Somebody can give 3, 5, 10 billions to their citizens. Some countries can give that, and other countries cannot. What is breaking the real electricity internal market? So this is so I try to set a common ground for everybody. And I think that this revenue cap that exists by the moment, and for me, should be removed in a few times, because it's not the time to have the revenue cap right now, okay? Because the revenue cap should be temporary. I think this is the concrete response. I think that it is clear that probably at the end, my proposal won't be the most precise one after the discussion. This is a starting point for the dialogue. I really believe that we need an emergency measure, such a revenue cap. I'm not saying that should be 180 forever. We have to take into account inflation. We have to take into account the inflation of the renewable technologies that we are suffering nowadays. It is true. It is kind of emergency measures for predictability and also to avoid the volatility that we have right now in the market.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas. Actually, I've got about another 6 or 7 questions for you, but I know you've got to leave now. Can I say thank you very much?
Let me say one thing. Yeah. I will put my mail in the chat. Only for this, please. And please send to me your questions, and I will try to answer as soon as possible. Okay?
Nicholas, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that was a terrific presentation. The bad news is we're going to be coming back to you again and again from the Florence School of Regulation, because you were so good. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And at least, I think on behalf of my colleagues, we really appreciate, as I say, the citizen-centric approach that you're taking here. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you to the Florence School of Regulation. I will be always available for you.
Thank you very much.
It's an European perspective, and it's very important for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good luck. So now I'll pass to Pierre from Wind Europe, Chief Policy Officer of Wind Europe. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Pierre. We really look forward to seeing what does the renewables industry need out of this process. And I'll ask another thing as well. What else do you want Catherine to do next year?
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks a lot to all of you, Florence School of Regulation, for setting up the panel. And it was fascinating to hear Mr. González Casares share his views in a very citizen-centric way. What I'll do now is a little bit rain on the parade with some actual numbers as to what this vision means for the market and for renewables deployments, if I may. I think this mandate has been pivotal for climate change and energy security. Climate neutrality is now enshrined in legislation. We will have very soon a new renewable energy directive with an ambitious renewable energy target of 42.5%. What this means for winds is that we essentially need to double the rates of deployments to around 30 gigawatt per year in the EU. Last year, we did roughly 16 gigawatts. So yeah, we need to go essentially twice as fast, right? Is this happening? No, it's not. Actually, all the major indicators are headed the wrong way. Investments in 2022 were massively down from 2021. So in 2022, we had 17 billion euros invested in wind energy, as compared to 41 the year before. 2022 again, as compared to 2021, turbine orders were down 47%. Third point, there was not one single final investment decision in a commercial scale offshore wind farm last year. We've seen a few since, but zero last year. And as you can imagine, with the ambition and scale up that we need, we can't really afford to miss a year in deployments, offshore wind or onshore for that matter. What is behind this? It's essentially, there are several causes, of course, but central to this has been the uncertainty around electricity markets, electricity market rules, future revenues, and stemming from, and this is essentially stemming from government interventions on electricity markets. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, the energy crisis has been acute. Of course, governments needed to do something. And it's true, Katarina explained this a little bit earlier on. We had to move away from the concept that this was impacting vulnerable citizens. It was impacting everyone, middle class, even upper middle class families were impacted, and businesses across the board. Governments had to do something. Hence the emergency regulation that came on the 7th of October last year and the revenue caps. But now, several months afterwards, we have the benefits of experience. We know that this has gone terribly, terribly badly. Not because of the initial European Commission proposal, if I may, which at the time we recognized as, a possible solution, a cap of 180 euros, applied across the boards, technology neutral. This was one possible approach. The issue was with the divergence. The central issue was the lack of harmonization. The fact that national governments were empowered to go apply revenue caps per technology, differing from one country to another, et cetera, et cetera. Governments deviated wildly from 180 euros per megawatt hour down to the 60s, for example, in Poland. A lot of governments had no clue how to apply in practice the fact that this revenue cap was meant to apply to realized profits only, because the reality of the market is complex. When you have hedging instruments, when you have virtual PPAs, etc., a lot of governments found themselves completely unable to put this in place in practice. And this has poisoned the well for investors, and we saw investment numbers crashed. As I just described. So let's be clear, something is required. It's impossible to disagree with Mr. González Casares that we want a market design that is future-proof and that drives electrification and drives renewables deployments. But this, and we heard this in the intervention of Mr. González Casares, the revenue cap could definitely be the poison pill for that, for the reasons that I just explained. Now, it's very important to recognize also that the European Commission did recognize this as part of their as part of the legislative proposal. There is an approach that is a sound approach suggested by the European Commission, which is a definition of what an energy crisis looks like with clear criteria, and then an obligation on electricity suppliers if necessary, to supply under their cost and to be compensated for it. This is clear, transparent, and has no impact on the necessary investments that we need in order to deploy more renewables and ultimately, shift away from volatile imported fossil fuels, which is what this full story is about. So a few things here. I think it's important, and Mr. González-Casares said it, the revenue cap is not necessary now, not at this very moment. It's supposed to run out in June. I certainly hope and expect that the European Commission's report expected for early June that you just mentioned, Katarina, will go in that direction and bear this out. And sincerely hope that the revenue cap across Europe will end in June, and then that it will not be enshrined in legislation as part of this electricity market design reform. Now, I must say we're really, focusing on the report of Mr. González-Casares for good reason, because this is the center of the discussion right now. We disagree with the points on the revenue caps. There are points that are positive, certainly around grids, grid connection regime, and the focus on deploying grids. We agree, for example, that having a power purchase agreement should not be a precondition or qualitative criterion to participate in a CFD auction. This is also something that Mr. González-Casares, has suggested to edit out of the proposal. So there's a lot to discuss, but bottom line, if we want to accelerate the deployment of renewables, if we want to displace imported fossil fuels, we need to make sure that there's a sound investment climate, that there's the visibility for investors. And the current proposal, as reinterpreted and amended by Mr. González-Casares, unfortunately would not deliver that.
Thank you very much indeed. I suggest that, well, perhaps Leonardo and Katerina, would you like to make any remarks on the basis of what Pierre and our previous speaker has mentioned before, and then I'll move it away from the price setting emergency measures, and we'll talk about the more technical stuff. So why don't we say Leonardo and then Katerina?
Okay, thank you. Let me make a point that I think when we in the school discussed this revenue cap, when the Commission came up with it, we applauded it because we thought, wow, what's the least distorting thing they can do, given that something needs to be done. And since then, so at that time, we thought really it would not create that many distortions. But since then, all that I hear, and even what Pierre just said, reinforces that even stronger, is that it has been much more distortive than anyone ever anticipated, right? So I think we still need to do the final assessment, but to my feeling, it's not that positive. I must admit that among academics, it's controversial. I've heard other academic colleagues be more favorable towards some kind of revenue cap. But I would say that even in theory, maybe some type of revenue cap could be less damaging than the one we had, but I really don't see it happening in practice. So I really still think that, we have really much more to lose than to win if we go down that route. Also, I think, as said by Pierre, you cannot disagree, right? That we really need to do something for citizens and consumers. It has been really dramatic, right? The last crisis, but there, I do think we can do a lot, which is not necessarily intervening in the market mechanism. It's more, just to give one example, instead of signing a lot of CFDs and allocating that money to vulnerable consumers, why don't you help them more directly? There have been cities where public authorities invested in PV rooftop on public buildings, and they offered that through energy sharing to vulnerable consumers in their city, right? You couldn't do that during the last crisis because you cannot build a PV rooftop during a crisis and have it ready to help these consumers, but you can do it right now to prepare for the next crisis, which I think is a much more local solution, right? That doesn't require any more centralized or harmonized change. So that's on the emergency measures. And then on the aspect where Katarina is more skeptical, right? On this reopening of capacity mechanisms. There, I hope, Katarina, that when we do a bit more analysis, because we have not yet done it ourselves, that we can maybe convince you in the sense that I think they are currently framed as something member states do if member states identify a problem. But I think if we look back at the current crisis that we just experienced, it's not only about countries that want to do something about their reliability. I think it could also be about countries that didn't do or don't do enough. Because in the future, I think we also want all countries to invest enough and not to rely too much on their neighbors, right? So you could also consider it, and maybe capacity mechanisms is not the right word for it, but some sort of mechanism that would assess and make sure that all countries contribute enough to the common good of reliability in Europe, right? To have enough backup, to have enough storage, to have enough flexibility, whatever we need to complement renewables. And countries can still make national choices on the mix, but whatever choices they make, they should also somehow be told to invest enough. And we should have, to my feeling, some sort of process, like a European adequacy assessment, not only used by countries to justify a mechanism, but also used by the European level to indicate that maybe some countries are not investing enough and putting the whole system at risk as a consequence of that.
Katarina?
Yeah, thanks. Reacting first on Leo's last point, I look forward to seeing your further analysis, and then let's discuss when you've done that one. But then let's say on the crisis measure, I think first of all, as fast as the Council and the Parliament may want to be in getting our proposal adopted, it will not be in force for the coming winter. So the coming winter will come without us having the legal package adopted and implemented. So that is the point one. And then the second point is that if we look at between now and 2030, which is only 7 years away, 80% of the renewables that need to be invested will still be invested. So and if these are implemented through PPAs and contract for difference, we will have already quite an important buffer in place by 2030. So the question then is, what crises are we looking at, and whether any adopted document will come early enough. But so that's what I wanted to comment on.
Thank you, Katarina. And I'd just like to pose one last question or observation, taking into account the various comments. And it's an open question to all three speakers. First of all, will the approach that the Commission's taken, balancing PPAs and CFDs, be enough to ensure that the benefits of low and lowering renewable energy costs, are actually passed on to consumers? Is there something more that should be done? For example, Francesc Bonvehi says, at the beginning we had firm power mainly, and then maybe the marginal market was right, but now intermittent power increasingly dominates national electricity systems. I doubt whether marginal markets are still appropriate. So that's one side. The other questions I think have come to is Daniel Rasmauer has pointed out that Minister Habeck has just announced that 5 billion euros will be spent every year in Germany to subsidize power prices for industrials until 2030. And so, it's all very well having price caps and all the rest of it, but there's a fundamental problem in terms of the internal market between countries that can support industry and countries that don't have enough money to do so, and what should be done in this respect. So I'll go reverse order this time, and I'll do Pierre, Caterina, and Leonardo. Pierre, what should be done to make sure that your members give pass on their benefits to consumers?
Yeah, I think the Commission's approach is exactly right. It's very balanced, really trying to see more and more power purchase agreements. I mean, fundamentally, we want to see the energy transition to be as market-driven as possible, or as consumer-driven as possible, right? The reality is we simply don't have enough credit-worthy off-takers right now to buy the volumes of renewable electricity that we need to get to net zero, right? We have quite a few. It's growing. It's reaching more and more sectors of the economy now, automotive, etc. It's gone well beyond IT, but still we're well short of the 30 gigawatts of wind per year that I was describing before. Yeah, therefore we need some sort of other routes to market. So there will be pure merchant investments, and then the CFD, the two-sided CFD, we believe is a good policy instrument, because indeed it gives visibility to everyone, and when electricity prices are high, it indeed gives revenues to governments that they can use potentially to help vulnerable consumers, etc. So this we believe is the right approach. Now, looking at a very future market design, perhaps we can speculate as to whether marginal pricing will work in the long run. But for the time being, wind is only 17% of power. I would wish for it to be a lot more, but it's 17% now, right? So I think it's too early to be questioning the fundamentals of the market right now. A time will come, but it's far too early.
So, Caterina, the time will come. I'll pass the floor to you.
Thanks. I actually agree with that, and I would say that with the increasing amount of renewables and the increasing amount of volatility, we need the marginal market even more than ever, because we need the price signal then to direct supply to where it is consumed. So that's why I think in the coming years, decade perhaps, at least we need the short-term market price signal more than ever. And here then, in order to also get more flexibility, get more demand response and more storage, and again later on with more hydrogen. And here again, the marginal price signal plays a key role. So therefore, I think what we perhaps need to think about is, because now the focus is really on the wholesale market, but maybe we need to think about how the retail market then works, and how it brings the benefits for end consumers, etc., etc. So maybe that's something for further exploring in the future. And then member states having different possibilities to support their industry. I mean, that is something we've seen, we know in the EU, and that's also in a way why we do have the cohesion policy in the EU, to also make sure that those who don't have such means can build their economies and catch up with the rest of the EU. But obviously, if there is support to go to industry in any respect, it will have to go through all the assessments that go together with state aid. So let's then see what the Commission will say if that proposal is notified to the Commission.
Many thanks, Caterina, and I leave the last word to Leo.
Just to reinforce once more that important comment that both Pierre and Caterina made, that this whole marginal pricing is still important in the future. And I think the intuition is that some people thought you add more and more renewables, right, at zero marginal cost, and prices will always be zero after a while. But this is not taking into account, for instance, storage, because what will really happen is that storage is going to set the price more than you think. So several academics have already done modeling of a zero carbon system in which you have much more storage than we are used to today. And you see that storage becomes price setting, so that only, when there is, the very few hours when that storage capacity, is not setting the price anymore because they're already full, then the price can go to zero. But in many other hours, is actually the storage doing the arbitrage and the arbitrage setting the price. So only to reinforce that, we really, really need this short-term price signal, and indeed even more than we do today, which is why it's good that we put all that effort the last 20 years in creating these markets at a scale that nobody has in the world, because sometimes we forget to applaud our achievements in Europe. I mean, there are many places in the world where they're jealous that we have this market at this scale. And yeah, so we should pressure, we should, improve it and fix it where needed, but we should definitely not go back in time.
Many thanks, Leo. Katerina, Pierre, many thanks indeed for taking the time with us today. Katerina, you must be the second busiest person in the EU after Nicholas. I think exceptionally somebody is more busy than you at the moment. So thank you very much indeed really for taking the time with us. Pierre as well, thank you so much. Your insights were brilliant. Leo, I also have to thank you, even though you're paid to be here. Andries, I'll pass the floor to you for the final comments.
Yeah, well, I also would like to thank Katerina, Nicolas, Leonardo, and Pierre. I think it was been great, great webinar. I think the challenge is quite obvious. From one side, it's quite simple. Electricity market worked well, delivered quite a lot. We know that we need to learn from experiences, from crisis experience. We know that the market design should be fair, or at least should be perceived being fair towards industry, towards citizens, towards member countries. And we know that this market design should provide for necessary investments, massive investments in energy transition. So the task or expectations are immense from this. And perhaps there are less pitfalls as it now feels around this issue. Perhaps there is a good, elegant ways in trialogue really to find all these elements in a right order. I know that it is not for a long time. We have had clean energy package and installing now solar panels on my roof. I benefited from this clean energy package because definitely administrative procedures have been nearly non-existent in Latvia. So it was so easy that you could not even imagine, and it was completely different before that. So that means that we are coming probably at some stage back again for electricity market design. But it would be good in this debate really to get some fundamentals that we don't test and we don't unnecessarily put some doubts for investors, because there are massive interests of investors investing in generation side. Pierre clearly said, well, interest is not enough. So there could be an interest as long as there is not real instance. It's not happening to the scale we needed. So we really need to advance quickly. And I believe there is all the reasons to believe that if European Union could master the crisis of the last winter, well, it could manage also to make it quite decent market designs that will serve our purposes. So thank you very much. And the last word is definitely thank you, Christopher. You have been brilliant. So I learned from you a lot. Thank you.
And thanks to the audience. Have a great day. Bye now.